This did not begin with a cry. The Uncrossed records it as case file TX-006. Subject, Isabel C. For centuries, the village remembered La Llorona. Co Mun-ha came to ask what name the river had been made to forget. The villages had warned their children for centuries. Do not go near the water after sundown. Do not go near the water alone. If you hear a woman crying somewhere along the river you cannot see, do not turn toward the sound. Keep walking. Keep your head down. Do not answer. The woman by the water had a name in the warning. La Llorona. The weeping woman. The mother who had lost her children and lost her place among the living and now moved along the riverbank in the dark, looking for what could not be returned to her. The warning did not always say what she had done. Some versions said she had drowned her children herself. Some versions said the river had taken them from her and she had gone in after them and could not find them again. Some versions did not say at all. The warning did not need to know. It needed only to be repeated, to children, by the river, at dusk. For 451 years, that was what the river contained. A category. A weeping. A name that ended in ona because the language she was being remembered in was not the language she had answered to. The village kept the warning. The warning kept the children safe. And under the warning, beneath all the centuries of repetition, the river kept something else. A name. Not La Llorona. The name a young woman had been called before the parish ledger of 1573 wrote a new one beside her christening, and before the river received what it could not return, and before the village agreed to forget she had been anything other than the cry. The name was Isabel C. But even that was not the name she had answered to. The river had kept the first one for 451 years. Before she became the cry, she was the person two children reached for when the fever came. She did not begin as La Llorona. In the autumn of 1573, in a small lakeside settlement on the central plateau of what the Spanish administration had begun to call New Spain, a woman of approximately 26 years lived in one of the 4 occupied households along the eastern acequia. Her household was Nahua. The acequia drew its water from a tributary feeding the long lake basin to the south. The settlement had been part of the older indigenous polity before 1521 and was now reorganized under the parish administration of the new diocese, with a small adobe chapel completed in 1568 and a friar arriving from the regional cabecera at intervals to perform baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Her household called her by a Nahuatl name that her grandmother had given her. The name meant something close to small water that returns at evening. It is not the name we will write here. The name appears in the testimony she left behind, and that testimony will be read at its proper place in this file. For now, the file uses the parish-assigned name from her 1573 baptism record, Isabel C. She had 2 children. The older was 3. The younger was newly weaned. The children carried Nahuatl names also. The parish administration had not yet baptized them at the time of the events documented in this case file. The household intended to bring them when the friars' circuit returned at the festival of San Andres in late November. She was a person before she became a warning. That is what this file is for. To set down, with the calm of an archive that has waited 451 years to be opened, that on the morning of the events in question there was a young woman in a household by an acequia who was carrying out the ordinary tasks of an ordinary morning. There was no cry yet. There was no warning yet. There was no category yet. There was only Isabel C. and her 2 children, and the water moving slowly south. The record did not call it grief. In late October of 1573, an outbreak of what the parish friar's annual report described as febre de las aguas, a fever of the waters, passed through the lakeside settlements of the central plateau. The illness took children first. The parish funeral register for that month records 7 indigenous infants and young children buried in the chapel yard between the 8th and the 22nd of October. The register does not list their pre-baptismal names. Several of the entries describe the children only by the Christian names assigned at their baptisms or, for those who had not yet been baptized, by the household of the mother. Isabel C's 2 children are not in the register. They had not been baptized. They did not receive a chapel burial. The household conducted what arrangements the household conducted, and the parish register did not record what those arrangements were. What the parish register does record, on the 24th of October, is a marginal note in the friar's hand beside the entry for the funeral of an unrelated child. The note refers to a complaint received that morning concerning the conduct of a household by the eastern acequia. The complaint was vague. The friar's marginal note is briefer than vague. It uses 3 words. Conducta dolorosa observada. Sorrowful conduct observed. The complaint did not say what conduct. No later entry explains it. No visit is recorded. No action is recorded. Only the household's disappearance remains. The next entry for that household is the household's removal from the parish census in March of the following year. The census line that had recorded 4 members of the household now records 0. The marginal explanation, written in a different hand and at a different time, says only, dispersados. Scattered. That is what the Colonial Archive contains, in 1573, on the household of Isabel C. 3 words of marginal note. 1 word of marginal explanation. And the silence between them, which the archive does not describe and which the village, for the next 4.5 centuries, filled with a warning told to children. The record did not call it grief. The record did not call it anything. The record left a space the village could enter. And the village entered. What happened next, the river received. This file does not reconstruct the events of the morning of the 23rd of October from speculation. It reconstructs them only from what the testimony of Isabel C. herself, recovered 4 centuries later from the back of a parish ledger page, says directly. The testimony says, the children had been ill for 6 days. It says the older child could no longer drink by morning. It says the household did not have what the friar's cabecera had. The household had what the household had. It says she carried the older child out to the acequia at first light, because the water was cool, and because the child was burning, and because an older woman in the next household had told her the new fever might be eased by the cool water if one came to the water early in the day. By mid-morning, the older child had stopped responding. She carried the older child back to the household and laid the child down, and went out to the acequia again with the younger child for the same reason. The younger child stopped responding by afternoon. The testimony says, she did not go in after them. The testimony says, she did not put them in. The testimony says, the river received what the fever had already taken. That is what the testimony of Isabel C. says about the morning of the 23rd of October, 1573. This file does not contest the testimony. This file does not extend the testimony beyond what the testimony itself sets down. The events of that morning are what they are, and they are not what the warning, told to children by the river for 4.5 centuries, made them out to be. The river received the children. The river did not take them. The river did not steal them. The river did not consume them. The fever had already taken them. The river received them. Isabel C. went home. She did not weep aloud in the village. The testimony does not say why. The testimony only says, I did not let them hear me. I did not have the language for what had happened in their language, and I did not yet have it in this one. That last line is the last line of her testimony for the day of the 23rd of October. 6 months later, the parish census recorded her household as scattered. By the autumn of the following year, the warning had begun, and after that, the village had a story. It did not happen all at once. The village did not gather one evening and decide what to say. The story moved the way stories move in places where the official record is small and the unofficial record is everywhere. A neighbor said something at a well. A grandmother said something to a grandchild. A traveling vendor carried a version to the next village along the lake, and the next village improved it, and the version came back 6 months later with details the original did not have. By the autumn of 1574, the warning had its full shape. There was a woman by the eastern acequia. She had lost her children. She had not buried them properly. She walked the bank of the water at night. She wept and could not be consoled. If a child heard her, the child should not approach. The warning did not say her name. The warning did not need her name. The warning had begun to do its work, which was the work of a small community organizing the inexplicable into a shape that children could be warned about. The shape did not need to be accurate. The shape needed to be transmissible. The shape needed to be repeatable at the threshold of evening, by the water, in any language the household had access to. The Nahuatl households called the shape one thing. The Spanish-speaking households called it another. The parish records, when they recorded folk practice at all, called it the Cuento de la Mujer del Agua, the story of the woman of the water. By the early 17th century, traveling clerics and the first generations of bilingual mestizo informants had begun to consolidate the name into the form the colonial archive would eventually receive. La Llorona. The weeping woman. The category was efficient. It could travel farther than a woman could. It did not require the actual woman. The actual woman was, by the late 1570s, gone from the parish census, gone from the household register, gone from the spoken record of the surviving households. The category did her work in her absence. The category appeared on the bank of the water at evening. The category wept. The category was avoided. The category was repeated to children, generation after generation, and the children grew older and repeated it to their own children, and somewhere underneath the 4.5 centuries of repetition, a woman who had once been Isabel C, who had once been called by a Nahuatl name that meant small water that returns at evening, became the cry the category was named for. The village kept the warning. The village did not know it was keeping anything else. The warning was the only thing the village still had. And the cry, by 1700, by 1850, by 1950, by 2024, had become the only public language that referred to her at all. The category did not remember her. The category replaced her. And the river, beneath all of it, kept the part the category did not need. The file reopened in 2024 because of a fold. A page in the 1573 funeral register had been bound with its inner margin pressed shut. The fold had remained flat for 451 years. When conservators at a diocesan archive in Puebla opened the fold as part of a regional digitization project, they found writing where no entry was supposed to be. The writing was in a different hand and a different ink from the surrounding entries. It was in late 16th century formal women's Nahuatl, transliterated into Latin characters by a hand that had been trained, almost certainly by a friar, to render Nahuatl phonemes in a Spanish orthography. The script was uncertain in places. The hand had not written often. The writing was not signed, but it was dated, in the same hand, in the lower right corner of the inner fold, 23 de Octubre, 1573. The text on the inner fold was the testimony quoted in this file seen 4. A first-person account, in Nahuatl rendered phonetically, of the morning of the 23rd of October. At the bottom of the inner fold, beneath the testimony, there was one additional line in the same hand. A single Nahuatl phrase. The script is uncertain. The archive's transliteration cannot be rendered with full certainty. The Nahuatl specialist consulted by the archive offered a working translation only, entered in the finding aid beside the original line. My name is not Isabel C. My name is the small water that returns at evening. That was the discrepancy. The archive contacted the regional Uncrossed liaison the following autumn. Co Mun-ha, who had completed the Ukiana case at a Tohoku hamlet 4 months earlier, accepted the assignment in February of 2024. She arrived in Puebla on the 8th of March. She spent 11 days in the archive reading the ledger. Then she went to the lakeside settlement that had once been the parish. It still contained an acequia that drew water from the same tributary feeding the long lake basin to the south. She walked along the acequia in the evenings. She did not approach the bank where the warning told children not to approach. She walked along the opposite side. She did not call out. She did not invite anything. She walked along the side of the water that the warning permitted, and she watched the light fail across the surface of the acequia, and she carried with her, in a small archival folder, a photocopy of the inner fold of the 1573 funeral register page, with the working translation entered along the lower margin in her own hand. Mi nombre no es Isabel C. Mi nombre es la pequeña agua que regresa al anochecer. On the evening of the 15th day, she stopped walking and stood at the eastern bend of the acequia where the warning, for 4.5 centuries, had told children not to stand. She did not weep. She did not summon. She did not perform a rite she did not have the standing to perform. She read the name aloud, in the language the testimony had asked to be read in. She read it once. And then she folded the photocopy and walked back along the side the warning permitted, and the warning, for the first time in 451 years, was not the only public language by the water. The cry was never the evidence. For 4.5 centuries, the warning had treated the cry as a sign of what had happened. A woman wept by the water because she had lost her children. A woman wept by the water because she had failed to bury them properly. A woman wept by the water because she had done something so unspeakable that the village could not say it aloud and could only point a child toward the sound and tell the child to keep walking. The cry, in the warning, was the residue of the act. This file proposes a different reading. The cry, in the parish funeral register of October 1573, did not appear. The cry, in the household census of March 1574, did not appear. The cry, in the testimony left on the inner fold of the funeral register page, did not appear. The first appearance of the cry in any record concerning the events of the 23rd of October, 1573, is in a written account by a traveling cleric in 1582, who passed through the settlement 9 years after the events and recorded, among other folk practices observed in the region, that the indigenous households of the parish warned their children of a woman who wept along the eastern acequia at evening. The cry, that is, did not arise from the events. The cry arose from the warning. The cry was the warning's organizing image. The cry was what the village needed in order to keep what had happened sayable to the next generation. What had actually happened was not sayable. What had actually happened was that a young woman had lost both children to a fever the parish had no remedy for, had committed her grief to writing in the only language her grandmother had taught her, had folded the writing into the inner margin of the parish ledger where, by some arrangement this file cannot reconstruct, she had been granted brief access to the volume, and had withdrawn from the household within months thereafter without leaving any further record of her movements or her end. The village could not say that. The village could say a cry. So the village said a cry, and the cry became the woman, and the woman became the warning, and the warning became the only thing about her that survived. But the cry was not the residue of the act. The cry was the residue of the silence the act had been wrapped in. The cry was the small acoustic shape the village had built around the unspeakable, so that the unspeakable could be held inside something children could be warned away from. The cry was not La Llorona. The cry was the name trying, across 4.5 centuries, in the only register the village had left it, to return. It was returning. In the language the village no longer remembered how to listen for. In the form the warning had been organized to dismiss. Every time the village told the warning to a child, the cry repeated. Every time the cry repeated, the name that had been beneath it tried to surface. Every time the name tried to surface, the warning forced it back down into the shape of the category. The cry was not the evidence of the act. The cry was the evidence of the erasure. Not proof that she had become the monster. Proof that the village had run out of language for her. And in March of 2024, on the bank of an acequia in central Mexico, a field investigator who had been trained to listen for exactly this kind of residue stopped on the side of the water that the warning permitted, and read the name back into the register the warning had been built to bury. The river turned over. The reading lasted a little under 15 seconds. The name was 3 words long in the transliterated Nahuatl. Co Mun-ha read each word at the pace the testimony had been written in. She did not raise her voice. She did not modulate it. She read at the pace at which the original hand had set the phrase down. When she had finished reading, she did not wait for an answer. The Uncrossed protocol, in such cases, does not request a sign. The protocol records that the reading has occurred and the protocol withdraws. The dead, if the dead are in any condition to receive the reading, are not required to confirm. The confirmation, when it comes in the form of the warning's loss of pressure. The warning may continue to be told. The category may continue to be repeated. But the category, after the reading, no longer occupies the entire register the warning had been built to fill. There is room, after the reading, for the name. In the weeks following Mun-ha's departure from the lakeside settlement, the diocesan archive in Puebla completed its conservation of the 1573 funeral register. The inner fold of the page in question was conserved with the testimony face-up. The page was rebound into the volume in such a way that the fold no longer presses the testimony out of sight. The working translation in the woman's own hand is now visible to any researcher who opens the volume to that page. The finding aid lists the entry under 2 names. The first is the parish-assigned name from the 1573 baptism record, Isabel C. The second is the working translation of the line on the inner fold, small water that returns at evening. The finding aid lists the 2 names together. The village continues to tell the warning. Children in the surrounding settlements continue to be told not to approach the eastern bank of the acequia at evening. The cry continues, in the form the village has carried for 4.5 centuries, to be the public language by the water. But it is no longer the only public language. The archive carries the other one now. The warning kept the children safe for 451 years. This file does not propose to lift the warning. The warning is not the crime. The warning is the small acoustic shape the village built around the unspeakable, and the warning continues to organize the unspeakable into something the next generation can be warned away from. The warning may continue. But the woman the warning was built around is no longer only the warning. The woman is also Isabel C., who lost 2 children to a fever in October of 1573, who set the loss down in writing in a language the parish administration was not yet trained to read, and folded the writing into the inner margin of a ledger so that someone 4.5 centuries later might find it. And the woman is also the name on the inner fold. Small water that returns at evening. The river did not return the children. It returned what the warning had buried. A name. The Uncrossed protocol records case file TX-006 as closed. Subject, Isabel C., and the name on the inner fold. Testimony complete. Crossing complete. Some crossings are not made by the dead. They are made by those who finally turn the river over. Cross-reference. Some crossings are not made by the dead. They are made by those who finally turn the river over. The Uncrossed. End of file.